Welcome back to the Street Writer Podcast. I'm your host, Noah. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've been enjoying the series so far. In case you are just joining us, we are looking at some of the greatest rivalries in the history of fighting games. Today, we're going to look at the culture that inspired some of the most unique rivals. Japan created many of the best fighting games. This cannot be argued. Part of this success was due to being at the right place at the right time. The genre was relatively young in the mid-80s, and every idea was fresh and unique. As soon as the developers figured out that a fighting game could be more than just video boxing, the world opened up. We can credit the various Japanese studios for many other firsts. They were the first to place fighters from different martial arts schools against each other. They created a narrative for the main characters. They added a way to track health, the ability to perform special attacks, and even the ability to destroy the environment on each stage. These details help pull the audience into the experience. The character designers working on these titles were influenced by a number of sources. Many of the early fighting game heroes were based on movie characters or even popular real-world fighters. Some were based on tough guy archetypes. In Japan, one of the popular tropes was the young rebel, a sort of gang leader that talked with his fists. Movies about gangs, coming of age, fighting, and violence are nothing new. The whole rebel identity is celebrated around the world, especially in pop culture. Cult movies like The Wanderers in the USA and modern films like Crows Explode in Japan capture a portion of the colorful and sometimes brutal side of life in a dysfunctional rather than dystopian society. A gang leader with a powerful sense of loyalty is someone to be admired. It doesn't matter if this is a novel, short story, or comic book figure. There are actually many positive features with the rebels in these works of fiction. In the USA, the leather-clad motorcycle rebels from the 50s, the Greasers, were one such archetype. Often they were runaways. Young enough to be in school, they often rejected authority. They felt smothered by the establishment and wanted to be free to run the streets. They lived hard, loved hard, and fought hard. They were essentially the replacement for the open-range cowboy from the previous century. Hollywood told their story, and in the process, they created icons like James Dean in film and the Fonz on TV. In Japan, there was a variation of the heroic rebel as well. These figures were often modeled after high school delinquents. In Japan, there's a tremendous pressure to conform. Conformity to family customs, societal expectations, and especially to authority. Just because a kid is in school doesn't mean they can't get habitually into trouble. This is something that US inner city schools know all too well. Troublemakers are sometimes perceived differently in Asian countries. In Japan, people don't always associate a group of rebels with a gang. Instead, they lump them together as a more benign group of delinquents. In pop culture, the leader of these gangs is known as a bancho. They are usually the toughest guy or the best fighter. They don't actually deviate much from the look of the typical high school kids. In fact, they can often be found sporting crisp school uniforms or gakuran. They might have a pompadour or perhaps shaggy hair, which shows a hint of nonconformity. These guys are magnets for trouble, and of course, the good girls who want nothing more than to fix a bad boy. The first video game fighter to exploit this look was Kunio-kun. The game, Neketsukona Kunio-kun, which translates to Hot Blood Tough Guy Kunio, was released by Technos in 1986. The character was named after Technos' former president, Kunio Takai. This game could be considered the godfather of the brawler genre. The arcade game was localized as Vigilante in the USA. The look of the hero and bad guys was changed from Japanese high school to more generic motorcycle gangs in order to make them appear more Western. People in the USA didn't really remember Renegade, but they did remember the NES version based on the series. You might know it better as River City Ransom. The characters were there, although they became shorter and more cartoonish in the process. Series creator Yoshika Kishimoto went on to design Double Dragon for Technos. The title from 1987 became a huge hit and established the birth of a whole new genre. Taito published a different sort of bancho fighting game in 1988. Kageki featured a heroic street boxer taking on every member of a local gang. Just about every gang and delinquent archetype from Japanese manga and cinema was represented here. The chubby, low-level goon, a slacker, a chisel-jawed heavy, a weasel-like henchman, the dirty fighter, and of course, the super cool gang leader. These characters included the various motorcycle and car freaks that identified with the Posuzoku, or violent speed tribes in Japan. Remember that the seminal Akira, the manga first published in 1982 by Katsuhiro Tomo, started with futuristic Bosuzoku gang, led by Kaneda and his rival the Clowns. Being a delinquent was not only cool, it turned out that a group of them could save the world. Anyhow, the various tough guys from pop culture all had to be defeated in Kageki. If a player scored a knockdown, then their opponent would be dropped down a manhole. It was easily the coolest way of disposing a body ever in a video game. The bancho had a sort of peak in popularity in the mid to late 80s. One of the first breakout manga titles was Os Karate-bu, also known as Karate Club, by Koji Takahashi. The series was first published in 1985 and ran through 1996. The story featured a mustached tough guy, Takagi Yoshiyuki. He was the overseer of the various gangs that used to take part in his club, which was really a front for organized, no-holds-barred fighting tournaments. Think of it like a high school fight club, where even mobsters and actual karate masters were allowed to compete. There was much more comedy and over-the-top fighters than the actual Fight Club movie and book, of course. A young character named Matsushita Tadashi would become the most famous person in the series and end up being its narrator. When he started high school, he would get beat up all the time. He joined the karate club in hopes that he would learn how to fight. He got even more beat up by the club members, but over the years, he grew stronger and learned how to fight back. The series hit a peak in 1994 when the manga was turned into a Super Famicom, aka Super Nintendo fighting game by Culture Brain. During the rise of the fighting game genre, Mr. Takahashi noticed that the boxer M. Bison from Street Fighter II had an eerily similar haircut to Takagi. He was sure to point it out when he created a parody cover in his comic. Young anti-heroes and delinquents were made cool in Akira and Os Karate-bu, but those weren't the only series focused on outsider culture. Previously in manga, anime, and live-action shows, the heroes were straight-laced good guys. The outsider, the rebel of the group, was still popular, but was never meant to be a replacement for the main hero. All that changed when manga and anime began featuring more anti-heroes and more stories that weren't set in campy henshin or sentai characters like the Power Rangers. Possibly the hottest and strangest manga in the mid-80s was JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The series, which began in 1986, revolved around Jotaro Kujo and his friends. Jotaro's uniform was a fashionable take on the Gakuran, with a big gold chain punched through the collar, a decorated cap, and multiple belts on designer slacks. When he and his friends battled, they used supernatural abilities against all sorts of crazy-looking characters. The series, by Hirohiko Araki, was influenced by Western pop culture. Their character names included musical acts Chaka Khan, Ronnie James Dio, Cameo, ZZ Top, Mariah Carey, Iggy Pop, and Devo, and it featured characters and costumes inspired by international fashionistas. His hero and allies were far from the traditional bancho. The words that would best describe them would be colorful, flamboyant, and eccentric. JoJo was on the extreme end of fantasy, yet there was another comic that was grounded in a more realistic world. Roku Denashi Blues featured heavy hitter Tyson Maeda. He was a scrappy boxer whose first name was reminiscent of Mike Tyson. Different spellings, of course. Anyhow, Roku Denashi Blues was as classic a manga as there ever was. The series, started in 1988 by Masanori Morito, was a straightforward look at the life of delinquents trying to survive high school, and of course, the girls that loved them. There were many encounters with various gangs and other school troublemakers. The fights lasted several panels, and the results of which would last months. Unlike other manga, where the heroes could be on the brink of death in one issue and then be perfectly fine the next, Tyson and his friends were left battered and bruised over the course of several story arcs. Jotaro and Tyson were the types of heroes that school kids could identify with, making them very popular with young audiences in the late 80s. It only made sense that the bancho would turn up in fighting games a few years later as the audience began consuming different forms of entertainment. Us Karate-Bu found its way to the Super Famicom in 1994, but so too did Roku Denashi Blues. Bandai developed and published the game. What made it unique was that the fights in the story mode happened in the same order as the encounters did in the manga. This level of accuracy would be used in the Dragon Ball Z fighting games by Bandai as well. Fighting Vipers was a lesser-known Sega fighting game from 1995. It revolved around youth culture, with skateboarders, rock musicians, and motorcycle thugs taking part in a tournament. The control and combo system were fairly easy to pick up, and you can imagine that the game was meant to be a younger brother to Virtua Fighter, the more popular 3D fighter from the publisher. The main character in Fighting Vipers was a 17-year-old Bon, a large bruiser whose costume was modeled after Jotaro's. His costume was part Gakuran and part samurai armor. He wasn't the only bancho to turn up in the genre. In 1997, Capcom released Rival Schools, United by Fate. That game was set entirely in a world where the top students, the most popular or the most delinquent from a half dozen schools, also happened to be excellent fighters. I don't mean traditional fighters either, but more like young versions of the Street Fighter All-Stars. A few characters wore traditional Japanese school uniforms, but Daigo Kazama, the big brother of motorcycle rider Akira Kazama, was the leader of a gang and central to the plot of the series. He had been brainwashed and was going around attacking students and teachers alike. The other students had to figure out why and get to the bottom of the conspiracy. Daigo's long coat, spiky hair, and nasty scar over his eye made him look like the ultimate badass bancho there ever was. The bancho was the hero that the new generation was following. There were stars in the comics and cartoons, and fans wanted to see them represented in fighting games, but the fighting game still had to do some evolving. The kung fu films and comics of the late 70s and early 80s inspired the development of Street Fighter and the other first-generation fighting games. The Japanese designers would try to create characters that had an international appeal, especially in the US, where they could make lots of money in the arcade and home consoles. So they took influences from cult western movies and mixed in that look with the Japanese manga aesthetic. The results were characters with very strong looks, karate fighters that wore traditional gis, Muay Thai fighters that wore the shorts, kung fu masters in wushu clothes, and literal street fighters that wore jeans and sneakers. This was what people expected to see. The bancho star wouldn't appear until later. SNK was doing very well at telling stories through a fighting game. They had a gritty theme in the original Art of Fighting. You could almost imagine this game was based on a pulp 80s film, with its seedy villains, imaginative locations, and twist ending. They also had the more anime-friendly Fatal Fury, which also had a great story and over-the-top villains. By the mid-90s, the studio knew that they had to come up with a radical new idea in order to compete against Capcom, Midway, and the other studios that were red hot. That was when they decided to formalize the King of Fighters tournament in 1994 and create a game that united the various fighters. For fans of the first generation of fighters, there would be both a Team Fatal Fury and a Team Art of Fighting. Each represented a nation, in this case Italy and Mexico respectively. SNK was not happy with the idea of Terry or Ryo being the solitary star of the game. They did not want fans to think the studio was telling them who would be the better fighter or who they should root for. They would let fans decide. To make things interesting, SNK went way back in their catalog of characters and brought back a few arcade pioneers. China was represented by a trio of kung fu masters. The leader was a pink-haired Athena Asmiya. Her psychic powers led to the state-sponsored team being known as the Psycho Soldiers. From Brazil, there was a trio of mercenaries. Two of the figures looked very familiar to arcade veterans, yet the one with the eye patch was new. It turned out that the guy with the blue baseball cap was Clark Still and the one with the red bandana was Ralph Jones. The two were better known as the Ikari Warriors, an arcade title that shared the same name. It was one of the pioneering run-and-gun shooters in the arcade. The Ikari Warriors were a mix of Sylvester Stallone's Rambo and Arnold Schwarzenegger's Commando. They could topple any dictator with their non-stop barrage of weapons and combat skills. In the original game, the characters wore a red headband or a blue headband so players could tell them apart. The game was revolutionary because it featured an octagonal joystick that could be rotated to aim in different directions while running in opposite directions. Prior to that, characters may be able to shoot left, right, or diagonally, but the joystick had to be pointed in that direction as well. Gamers could suddenly strafe opponents while moving between cover. Seeing the Mercs return as fighters was a welcome surprise. Perhaps they were the best brawlers in the King of Fighter universe instead of Terry or Ryo. It turned out that the Chinese Athena and her partner Xie Qianxiu had appeared previously as well. They were in a game called Psycho Soldier, which didn't see that much popularity in the US. It was a side-scrolling action title, but instead of flying a spaceship as was the case with most side-scrollers, this game had Athena and Xie using their psychic powers through the real world and underworld. The game was actually connected to a previous title called Athena. It was based on the Greek goddess and had players building her armor and fighting to reclaim Olympus. That game was an action platformer in the vein of Capcom's Black Tiger or Ghosts and Goblins. The modern Athena was descended from the goddess. Both the Ikari Warriors and Psycho Soldier were released in 1986, and both represented SNK's older and more cult favorite titles. It was great that SNK was acknowledging their legacy and putting the various characters into one continuity. Yet something was missing. It was great to see the fighting game stars and other arcade stars introduced into a tag team battle, but the groups were found lacking. The studio needed to introduce a new team or a couple of new teams that would represent the franchise and stand up to the stars from the other titles. These characters would have to become the next generation fighting icons. Once again, the studio looked at pop culture for their inspiration. They had done what they could with classic movie heroes and villains, and they needed to find something more contemporary. They found that the bancho was a hero they hadn't yet considered. An amazing rivalry would grow out of this character choice. We'll explore this story in the next entry. As always, you can follow me on my blog at streetwriterpodcast.blogspot.com. I also publish my fighting game entries on Capcom Unity under the name Big Mex. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sponsoring me on Patreon or subscribe to me on SoundCloud. Thank you for the people that are already subscribing to me, and I hope to see you on the next entry.